Hello everybody, my name is Smalls, this is Black94, and I am going to review Netflix's Iron Fist. This is going to be my first real Netflix review. I've been waiting to do some of these, thanks to a certain upgrade in my recording material. So, let's get into it. First of all, I had read many critic reviews of the first 6 episodes. There has been a lot of controversy with the white savior stereotype, and so on and so forth. So, by the time it came out, can you guess where my expectations were? Low. Incredibly low. Even for Marvel Netflix, I couldn't get my hopes up. However, I'm actually kind of glad they were pretty low, because overall, I enjoyed the show, mainly because it was a lot better than I expected, even though it still wasn't up to the other ones. And I'll say where I got my personal enjoyment out of it. But don't go in with high expectations. If you go in with lower ones, you'll probably enjoy it better. And I will be avoiding all sorts of spoilers until the halfway mark. I'll give a warning when I start getting to spoiler territory later in the review. First off, let me start off with soundtrack. The soundtrack was surprisingly good. And I'm not getting into too much detail of it, but when the first episode started off with Outcast, me and my father, who were watching at the time, were completely sold on it. And when the episode ended on the same exact song, I have to admit I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't expecting Danny Rand to be, obsessed with hip-hop, but I guess it makes sense for rich white kids to love hip-hop culture. I did go to a high school where they had a lot of rich Jewish kids who loved Biggie Smalls, where I got my nickname Smalls from, mostly. But that's besides the point. It was a surprising twist. His love for hip-hop, it wasn't the same as Luke Cage's soundtrack. I'm not going to put it on that pedestal, but it surprised me. It made Danny for me a little bit more. But let's get into one of the gripes. Danny as a character. And I'm not talking about the white savior stuff. I actually don't care about that in any way, shape, or form. Because it's 2017. I'm going to be honest, most stereotypes, while outdated, the white saviors thing doesn't bother me at all. I'm a black man. Then again, I'm not an Asian. But from what I've read of, interviews and such and so forth, I can see that Marvel really wasn't really thinking about this. I'm not saying not thinking about it in the bad ways, and they just weren't thinking or giving two shits. I'm saying it wasn't really a problem, because they also did interview Asian actors. Now, I don't have a list of those, and I probably should have. Probably would raise my cred up. But no, Marvel was surprisingly open-minded, and in the end, they chose Finn Jones. Now, once again, I'm not getting into spoiler territory right off the bat, but Finn Jones did okay. It wasn't the best. Like I said, I enjoyed this show as a whole, but it's still nowhere on the level of the other Netflix shows. Case in point being the characters. Now, somewhere deep down, I will admit to having a nice little fan boner for Colleen Wing and Joy Meacham, because bravo to the actresses who played them, and bravo to the casting directors. I have to admit, I loved every scene with those two characters, and not just because I had a nice, healthy excitement when both of them were in any sort of scene. Okay, maybe it had something to do with that, but jokes aside, the supporting cast evolved over time, from the good guys to the bad guys. Maybe another thing that maybe didn't work for it was the fact that it was such slow pacing that for the first half of the series you can't really tell who the main bad guy is. Because in the end, in that first half, there's so much going on that there are a number of antagonists that could also be shown as supporting characters, period. To the point where everyone is an antagonist in their own right. Hell, even Danny's naivety is what gets in his own way half the time. So, there is a lot of pacing issues. Then again, there's always pacing issues in these Netflix shows, but they were extremely here in Iron Fist. Maybe some people didn't get the message that this was supposed to be just as good as the others, and they just ended up making this kind of like a segue to Defenders. And that's basically what Season 1 of Iron Fist added up to in the end. A big segue for the next chapter in the Netflix series. Especially considering how much they tied the hand in. And speaking of tying things in, Claire Temple, a little minor spoiler, but most of you have seen her in the trailers by now. Claire comes in and she brings this entire world together. And I like that. It really pulls together some sort of connectivity, having her in every single little thing, with constant nods to all three of the other heroes, even if like characters like Madame Gao didn't think of all three. Like, she continuously only mentioned Murdoch and Cage, never mentioned Jessica Jones. There were a few mentions of Jessica, and, not too spoilery, but there was a character from the Jessica Jones roster who made prominent appearances throughout the season. More like guest appearances, but enough to become a supporting character in her own right in this series, although in a bit of a different tone. And I'm okay with that. She also had an appearance in Luke Cage, so it's nice to see other characters aside from Claire popping up around the series. Good. Now here's where I'm going to get into spoiler territory. So, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you have been warned. Starting with how the hand ties in, I'm going to say there wasn't a lot of originality when it came to the hand's plans. Like, there was no mention of the black sky for starters, which I guess was either good or bad, but there was a lot in terms of nothing was really meant to be final. For example, Bakuto, a person who was introduced midway through the series, ends up being a member of the Hand, and yet there is no real finality to his character when he meets his end, so to speak. And same with Madame Gao. She's free once again, and we still, ironically, don't know much more about her. If anything, we now can connect her to the Hand, which is funny considering not only was she not even hinted at being connected to the Hand previously, but she was primarily featured in Daredevil, in which the Hand was primarily featured, and in terms of where she was even more featured in Wilson Fisk's, little group, there was another section that was actually the Hand themselves already. So what was the point of having those two Japanese and Chinese factions when both of them are directly tied to the Hand as of now? It makes no real sense in that particular notion. So I don't even know where to put it. But at the same time, it does look like there are some groups within the Hand, as, it's quite weird. Like, I don't know how to put it, but it wasn't really fleshed out that much. It just looks like we got more questions than answers in terms of the Hand, which will all be answered in the Defenders, which makes for a huge disappointment in my opinion. I personally wanted to know more about everything the series had to offer, from its hero to its villains. For example, we never get to see the dragon, so for all we know, it still could be a metaphorical dragon, not a freaking physical dragon, which pisses me off in a way, because I wanted to see that particular part. This is Iron Fist, not the prologue to Defenders, because if they show the dragon in Defenders or something like that, where Kunlun's teachings will become more front and center with the Hand being the main villains, I don't know what to think about that. So in that case, this series did not exactly deliver in ways of tying itself up in any way, shape, or form. But, at the very least, there was one little storyline that was pulled together, and that was the Meacham family story through Harold. But before I get into that, let me just continue segueing in terms of the Hand was mostly featured as what would be the main villains in almost every way, shape, and form, and then Harold, who was obviously a villain, ends up being the big bad at the very end, which in one way makes sense, but then you think about it, it doesn't exactly, because the Hand is still out there. The Hand is still a big threat. It's not like the Hand was some small group that was being manipulated by Harold in any way, shape, or form. So what I'm saying is, there was no real antagonist, to pull together this series as a whole, because Harold was obviously evil, and yet at the same time, he played a supporting role for most of the series. Even up to his first death in the series, he was still a supporting character with malicious intent at best. And then everything's brought to the forefront, as if it wasn't already telegraphed that was going to be the case. And yet it still felt pushed, unnatural, to the point where even Danny's scratching his head like, what the fuck is going on? And then everything is just... Danny is so naive as the main character, too. It makes it worse that there was so many different villains. None of them really screamed big bad. The antithesis to Danny. On top of that, we got the Steel Serpent in his pre-Steel Serpent civilian guise, Davos. And he popped in even later in the series and was also a supporting character who had malicious intent, who in the end turned upon Danny literally right after they got finished taking care of another big bad. You see where I'm going with this? The word big bad is just thrown around in a sense that it's not really there. There's just so much conflict and no resolution. Even the, end of the season as a whole, it's just so haphazard. But I did like seeing some things. Like, I'm going to be honest, I started this saying that this series was good, but not as good. Now let me say why there is some saving graces. For instance, as naive as Danny was, there was some sense of growth in his character. And Colleen Wing, who was way more noticeable than Danny himself, made for an excellent supporting character who honestly could have been a protagonist in her own right. And she did everything. She was blind. She was, in the end, part of the criminal organization. Like I said, this is the spoiler half, so if you guys were expecting me to steer clear of that, good luck with that. She was part of the Hand. She grew. She realized how bad the Hand really was. Not just the Hand as a whole, or Gao's group of Hand, but the one that she belonged to, and the one that she delivered these innocent kids straight into. So in the end, she realizes her wrongs, and honestly, she could have, like I said, very well been a star of her own series, and felt more like a protagonist than Danny ever did. And it's sad, but I liked her much better. Not just because she was really hot, but because she was actually compelling. But don't get me wrong, there were some points where you have to cheer Danny on. Some points where you actually, okay, this naivety's okay, before it gets out of control. And Claire, I liked seeing her character evolve from how she's always the one who heals, and then for the first time, we really get to see her dish out the pain. Like at first, it looked like, her learning stuff from Colleen, and probably being the one student of hers not taken into the Hand. She was literally like the It looked like she was just going to be there. It looked like she was getting some exercise, at best. But no. After her travels in Season 2 of Daredevil and Season 1 of Luke Cage, she realized she needs to be able to protect herself. And sure, she didn't exactly do the best of it in the start, but she really, really came in on her own during the second half, to the point where she actually managed to back up Colleen and Danny against the Hand in a 3-on-2 fight. And now she has her own little weapons of her choosing. I like that. Her growth as a character and Colleen's growth as a character, I liked them both. And, the Ward and Joy Meacham were also great characters in their own right, except for the one little part with Joy at the very end. Because no matter what you say about, Joy, up till the very end, her writing was near consistent. And then it just spiraled off in the end. Sure, she was a businesswoman, but she was nowhere near as far gone as Ward was, in the point where it's pretty obvious that Ward was like 99% sure that Danny was who he said he was near the beginning of the series. And yet still, from his businessman's perspective, as well as the secret of his father being alive, he was a little bit more evil than his sister, who was just a businesswoman, not even evil per se. But he came into his own, and she completely did a 180, making a deal with Davos, or I don't care, Steel Serpent to be, in quite the strapping suit, I might say. But I want to end this before this gets too long. It's already 17 minutes in, so I'm just going to go off saying the main things that made this was the supporting cast, some of the soundtrack, and what broke this for me was honestly Danny in his own, the inconsistent writing style, and of course the lack of real concrete villains. Like, if there's anything you can say about the previous Netflix series, they had good villains. Maybe not Daredevil Season 2 per se, aside from the Hand as a whole, but at least, Luke Cage was, the first to see a tiny decline in villains, but I loved Cottonmouth. But this series, I can't say I really had a favorite amongst these villains, because there was no likability among these villains. Of course, you're not really supposed to like villains, but you get my point. God damn it, Siri. Alright, well, thank you guys for listening in. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out my other social media. And I hope to see you guys next time when I do another one of these reviews. If you guys have any suggestions of what I should watch on Netflix and review, please put them in the comments down below. I hope to see you guys again. Till next time.